Hey there again, AP Environmental Science. Here we go with sustainability, economics, and equity. This is a two-part series here. We're going to break this down into sustainability and economics together, and then talk about the regulations that affect equity. Measuring wealth and productivity. There's a variety of ways to measure wealth and productivity. While there's no really consensus on which method is the most accurate and each has its own shortcomings, researchers do agree that measuring wealth and productivity can be a useful way of examining the health of an economy. You know, Here we're going to talk about most common and widely accepted measures of wealth and productivity and then look at some alternatives. So, GDP. Economists use different national economic measures to gauge the economy wealth of a country in terms of its productivity and its consumption. Most of them do not take externalities into account, as we said before. The most common measurement is GDP, gross domestic product, and that refers to the value of all products and services produced in a year in a given country. GDP includes four types of spending. We call that consumer spending, investments, government spending, and exports, minus the imports. A measure of well being is also sometimes included. But a measure of well being, as far as GDP, it's been criticized for a number of reasons because the cost of healthcare contributed to higher gross domestic product. A society that has a greater deal of illness would likely have a higher GDP than an equivalent society without a great deal of illness. So, such an inclusion does not appear to be very accurate and not a reflection of wealth or well being of society. And because externalities such as pollution and land degradation um, are not included in GDP, the measurement of GDP does not reflect the true cost of production. Some scientists say that in order to maintain a good GDP or to increase GDP, the best way is to improve the global environment and increase GDP in less developed nations. And as we talked about before, where we talked about failing birth rates, GDP increased and population growth slows. So this in turn should lead to the reduction of some environmental degradation. Wealthier developed countries are able to purchase goods and services that will lead to environmental improvements. So, for example, pollution control devices like catalytic converters and use them as a resource more efficiently if they can put them into cars and afford to put them into vehicles. On the other hand, as we've seen, developed countries use many more resources than developing countries, and that actually leads to even more environmental degradation. GPI. We've seen that GDP is an incomplete measurement of economic status in a country because it only considers, production. Some researchers attempt to address the shortcomings of this by using another measurement term, which we call the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. And it is the measurement of the economic status that includes personal consumption, income distribution, levels of higher education, income distribution, levels of wealth and population, resource depletion, pollution. Did I say that already? Pollution. Um, it's easy for me to explain this on a graph. All right, if you look at this figure here, what you can see is that while GDP in the United States rose steadily from the 1950s through 2004, GPI has been virtually level since about 1980. A number of countries like England, Germany, Sweden, we've recalculated their GDP using the GPI, and we have found that their overall wealth, when human and environmental welfare were all included, is actually steadily declining over the last 3 decades. And why is that? If you ever wanted to say something in Russian, it's called the Kuznets Curve. Can you make it sound just like something out of a World War II movie? The Kuznets Curve. I had an economist professor who was Russian, and he just didn't like how country I was when I said the Kuznets Curve, and so he made me repronounce it all the time. All right, anywho. So, to address some of these shortcomings of GDP as measurements of wealth, some environmental economists and scientists advocate a model known as the Kuznets Curve. And this curve, which is shown here on this diagram, basically suggests that the per capita income in a country increases. Environmental degradation first increases and then it tends to decrease. So the model is controversial because it is not easily applicable to all situations. But for example, despite the increasing affluence of developed countries, carbon dioxide emissions and uh, solid waste from municipalities, um, that generating waste, they've both been continue to increase as the country is becoming more developed. And so it is possible that these developed countries are not yet wealthy enough to deal with a lot of these problems very effectively. But it's also possible that there are certain problems that cannot be solved simply with greater wealth. Countries become wealthier, residents tend to use more fossil fuels, they tend to travel more, and so they consume more resources, and this just generates more waste. Sometimes less developed countries experience technological leaps without having to go through this phase of all this development. These kinds of changes may influence the shape of the Kuznets curve and influence how something is characterized in any given situation. Technology transfer happens when less developed countries adopt technological innovations that were developed in more wealthier countries. In many less developed countries, a significant portion of the population uses cell phones without ever having access to a network or even a landline phone, period. A situation in which less developed countries use technology without first using the precursor technology is also what we call leapfrogging. Now, leapfrogging occurs whenever new technology develops in a way that it makes older technology unnecessary and obsolete. And so this allows the developing nations to take advantage of this research and this development and experience things more like developing countries do, or I'm sorry, that more like developed countries do. Solar energy is a particularly good example of leapfrogging. Many industrialized nations, solar electricity has not been cost competitive with like gas or coal generated electricity, but it's been very successful in some nations like Africa, Asia, South America that basically lack resources to build and rebuild electrical distribution grids. So, solar energy is a small scale energy source, not dependent upon the outside world and the outside connections to basically build an electrical grid system. In fact, it is possible that many less developed countries will continue to increase and use solar energy and basically skip the step of building a nationwide electrical grid altogether. And that's really likely to happen. And with cell phones versus landline telephone services, solar energy allows developing countries to produce and distribute their own electricity without the investment of this massive infrastructure, which is created by phone systems, and an electrical distribution grid that would be needed for a developed country that it already had.